I'd like to thank you for watching our podcast on the book of Second Corinthians. Today we're in Second Corinthians, the first chapter, verse number 7. The Apostle Paul is talking about something that we don't like to talk about. He's talking about sufferings, and he's talking about comfort in the midst of sufferings. And this is what he says in verse number 7. He says, "And our hope for you is firmly grounded." What's Paul saying? He's writing to the Corinthians. He's writing to a church that has come back into relationship with God. He's writing to a church that's been reconciled. And he's saying to them, our hope for you is firmly grounded. Now, what's hope? Hope is an expectancy of the future. Paul is saying, you know what? I am looking at the future, and that future is firmly grounded. Now, why is that? Because Paul is constantly coming to them, and he's giving them the comfort that God has given to him. If you don't understand what I'm saying, go back to the other podcast this week, because the Apostle Paul is talking about being comforted by God in our afflictions, in our sufferings, but also then taking that same comfort and giving it to someone else. And so Paul says, in the midst of that, in the understanding of that, he's saying, you know what? My hope for you is firmly grounded. In other words, it's settled. It's settled. You know, if you're a builder and you bring in dirt or concrete or whatever, you have to allow that to settle before you can go ahead and begin to build on it. That's exactly what Paul is saying. Our hope is settled. Our expectancy for you is settled because we're constantly giving you the comfort that comes from God. Now, let's go on in verse number 7. Knowing that as you were sharers in our suffering, so also you are sharers in our comfort. What's Paul saying? He's saying you're sharing with us. You're going through the same things we're going through. By the way, if you ever look at another believer and you think that they don't have problems, that they don't have some type of suffering, it may not be the same type of suffering that you have, but you know what? They're going through times of suffering. They're going through times of need. And so the Apostle Paul is saying, we're knowing, we have this knowledge. We have this full knowledge. Actually, the Greek word there is epignosis, and it means to have a full knowledge of something. We have this full knowledge that as you are sharers in our sufferings, in other words, you're going through sufferings just like we are. But then he goes on and he says, so also you are sharers in the comfort, in our comfort. In other words, Paul is saying, we're going through things ourselves. But on the other hand, we know and we have received from God words of comfort. Again, this word comfort is the Greek word paraklesis, and it means words of comfort. Spoken words. Kalesis is the root word there. Kalesis means something spoken to comfort. And so Paul is telling the Corinthians, just like you received suffering, we have received suffering. But as we have received comfort, you also have received words of comfort. Verse number 8. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, for our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond strength, so that we despaired for our lives. What's Paul talking about? Well, he said, I want you to understand something. He's saying this to the Corinthians, and I believe he's saying it to us. What is he saying? He says, I don't want you to be unaware. You know, The wonderful man that led me to Jesus told me, Leon, after you give your life to Jesus, everything's going to be great. Well, you know what? I found out very quickly that wasn't true. There were people that didn't appreciate me being a believer. I went through times where people turned their backs on me. Friends, so-called friends. You see, the Apostle Paul is telling us that we need to be aware of something. We need to be aware of suffering, but we also need to be aware of the comfort that God brings. Now notice, he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia. What's he talking about, Asia? There he's talking about what would be Asia Minor, would be modern-day Turkey. He's talking about what happened in Ephesus. What was happening in Ephesus? The Roman government was stepping up persecution of believers. He's talking about a burden, persecution. Now he goes on and he says that we were burdened excessively. What is it? He said, actually, the word burdened excessively means to be crushed. Now, I don't believe he's talking about a physical crushing, even though they were killing Christians. I believe he's talking about something that was weighing down on them to the point where they were feeling crushed. They did not have the freedoms that they used to have. And he says, we were burdened excessively, and then he goes, beyond strength. Beyond strength. We didn't have much strength. That's what the Apostle Paul says. And then he says, and we despaired for life. This word despaired means to expect to lose something. In other words, we were there and we thought that at any minute we could lose our lives. But then what does Paul do? Paul continues on. And this is what he says in verse 9. Indeed, we have the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. What's Paul saying? He said we didn't trust in ourselves. We had in ourselves the death sentence, the sentence of death in ourselves that we would not trust in ourselves. You see, listen to me, brothers and sisters, as we bring this week to a close. When you're going through afflictions, when you're going through sufferings, through hard work, or whatever the suffering is, one of the things that you need to constantly keep in mind, that you trust in God. That you trust God. Now, Paul says that in God who raises the dead. You know, back in 1 Corinthians, we talked about the resurrection. Paul is focusing in on this fact that even if we die as believers, God still raises the dead. Paul is calling to the attention of these Corinthians, this life is not the end. God is always there, and he raises the dead. Think about that as you go through your weekend. God bless you. Join us again on Monday.